Dr. 𝙎𝙀𝙇𝙊𝙐. Welcome to Cell Radio.
It's great to be with you, John. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm thrilled. You are obviously a very accomplished person in the space of helping entrepreneurs. You're the author of The Entrepreneur's Guide to Keeping Your Shit Together, which I love the title. And of course, another book, which is also not necessarily directly related, but I think it has a lot of related topics to what we're going to talk about today, which is Touching Two Worlds. Those two books, along with Zen Founder Podcast, I wanted you to come on the show to talk a little bit about how entrepreneurs can navigate this journey from owning their business to a successful and happy life after being the owner of their business. And so that's the context I was hoping to have you on. So thank you for doing this.
My pleasure. It's a conversation I love having, and I think it's really important. So happy to jump into it with you.
How did you stumble into this world of entrepreneurship? Because you're a trained doctor, I believe, of psychology, right?
Yeah.
Do I have to call you a shrink or doc from now on? Or can I call you Sherry?
Sherry's great. Sherry's great.
Awesome. So how did you stumble into working specifically with entrepreneurs?
I started my career working with people who had what I would call high intensity jobs. So folks in the military, ER docs, people who are first responders. So folks who were exposed to a high level of stress, often life and death kinds of challenges in the context of their work. And we're in need of some mental health care around how do we transition between the intensity of work and having coffee on Tuesday with your significant other or picking your kid up from soccer. And I really loved this work because it's people who really pour a lot of themselves into their vocation. So I'm doing this work, and then I'm married to my husband, 𝙁𝙊𝙐𝙇𝙊𝙐, who is a couple times over entrepreneur in the tech space. And
we've had Rob on the show, by the way, so people will be familiar with the name 𝙁𝙁𝙐𝙊𝙐. And of course, he has his own podcast, great show, Startups for the Rest of Us. Everybody should listen. But so you're married to Rob. So
so there's tech entrepreneurs in my living room all the time. And these are the people that are our friends and our community. And as I was just getting to know this world of entrepreneurs, really hearing some of the same challenges that they were experiencing that I was seeing in my clinical clients. Challenging shifting between work and other parts of life, and real deep sense of identification with their business, which is both good and problematic. So I decided to really transition my focus to be able to be of support to the entrepreneurial community in the context of all of the mental health challenges that go along with going all in on a business.
Talk to me about mental health challenges, because I've read some statistics over the years, and I haven't been able to validate them. So maybe you can do it for me. But I've heard things like entrepreneurs are more likely to struggle with some forms of mental illness, more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. More likely to be, of course, Richard Branson is a very obviously famous example of dyslexia,
Mm-hmm.
which I don't believe is a mental illness per se, but obviously it may be a learning disability of some sort. What's your stats? What do your stats say about entrepreneurship and mental health? Just give me the objective numbers.
Yeah. So there's, I believe to date, only one significant study that's looked at mental health in entrepreneurs, and that's by Michael Friedman, who is he has a joint appointment at UC Berkeley and UC San Francisco. Wonderful psychiatrist, personal friend. And he's the one who has dived into this question. So the research does suggest that, or his research to be specific, suggests that there are higher levels of bipolar disorder and ADHD in entrepreneurs than there is in the general population. And there's some evidence that entrepreneurs in general are a little bit more worried about their mental health than other folks. So when you ask an entrepreneur, hey, are you worried about yourself? Are you worried about what's going on between your ears? In his research, 72% of them said yes. I'm a little worried about how it's feeling to be inside of my brain right now.
Wow.
Which is, again, it's higher than the general population. Does that mean that entrepreneurs are they more mentally ill, or they're having more mental health issues? I'm not sure that it does. I think that one of the ways that we break down when we have a conversation about mental health is about normal and divergent. And when we are looking at how brains function, the more neurodivergent a brain is, the more, I don't know, like creative, outside of the box, nonlinear. In some ways, it's seeing opportunities and has these extra capacities and superpowers that may show up in entrepreneurs more often. Somebody who has a bipolar 1 or bipolar 2 way of operating in the world is going to have a more difficult time working in a cubicle at Google, but they might be able to adjust to an entrepreneurial life much more easily. So I think entrepreneurship opens doors and really can validate some level of neurodivergence when we compare it to, our sort of 9-to-5 typical work for somebody else workers.
You just get the gold star for using neurodivergent twice in one episode. It's the first time I've ever heard neurodivergent in like 350 episodes. So you, my dear, get the gold star. Awesome. So I want to go further on this, because the other thing I've heard, and again, I don't have any hard data, and I'm hoping you might, is that entrepreneurs have a proclivity towards substance abuse. That the same neurodivergence, now I'm using it, meaning their brain just can't shut off, means that they turn to self-medicate to try to get their brain to shut off. Have you seen anything to suggest that that's more than just the subjective sort of observation on my behalf?
Yeah, I think Freeman's research does suggest that entrepreneurs are more likely to have a history of substance abuse. And I think in some ways that's where we're getting into personality type. The kind of folks who are all in on something, they can, I don't normally say this, but I think one way of thinking about successful entrepreneurship is a little bit like you have an addiction to making this business successful, which is really relevant for our conversation around exiting, because what happens when you can't be addicted to that thing anymore? Mm-hmm. And so that ability to be hyper-focused or to have a brain that is organized around the satisfaction, the dopamine hits that come from little successes in a business is not that different from a brain that's really satisfied by that next shot or that next hit or that next sort of chemical infusion of experience. Entrepreneurs also are really high on something called openness to new experience. They're longing for and looking for novelty. And so that's a little bit of what could be a sort of underpinning of addiction, healthy addiction and less healthy addiction.
Isn't that interesting? So just the openness, hey, try this. Feels great. That's often something.
I'll try that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll try that. Yeah, exactly. Got it. Interesting. So you've got a kind of powder keg when it comes to going to exit a business, because you've got an entrepreneur who already has, to some extent, a proclivity towards some form of mental health issues. You've got a very high impact role, which is wrapped up, in many cases, their identity is deeply wrapped up in their role. And then they go to exit their company. What advice would you have for an entrepreneur who is contemplating exiting their business, selling their company?
I think one of the best analogies that I can think about for the kind of psychological process of an exit feels really relevant to me because I just had a kid graduate from high school. But it's a very similar sort of process in launching a child. So someone that you've spent 18 years developing, investing hours and hours and hours and hours into the development of this human. And the relative emptiness that I think a lot of people feel after that person has left the nest. So that can be a very positive thing for all involved, or it can be a very, very troubled, difficult, grief-oriented time for all involved. And so the same is true in the process of preparing to sell a business, is all of the psychological and emotional and identity gymnastics that go into a positive exit require a lot of work and attention. And I think that's probably the first thing that I would say to folks who are thinking about selling, is to just give yourself time and space for the inner work that needs to happen in order for that to be a positive completion of a story and a launching point to a new story, rather than this like terrible ending where you feel unsatisfied and alone. And
what's the work we need to do? You mentioned give yourself the time and energy and space to do the work. What's the work?
I think the work is a lot of personal contemplation. Who am I without this business? That's a hard question. So having spaces where you're thinking about it, having spaces where you're talking about it, and how can I be of service to this business as it's growing beyond me or as it's having an outcome without me, and detach in a way that's helpful? And then how do I rebuild myself after having spent so much time creating this business? The sort of what's next question most entrepreneurs run into headlong too quickly. They don't give themselves the time and space to really consider what they want or what they need their lives to be after the ending of a business.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We have this tool called Prescore, and we get people to write down all of their push factors, the things that are frustrating them about their company, tax, payroll, employees, whatever. And then what are their pull factors? In other words, what do you want to go do? How do you plan to reinvent yourself? What are the things that you want to accomplish? And I think people really struggle with the pull factors. And so I'd love to get your thoughts on how to go from the superficial to the more meaningful. So for example, we would see stuff like, well, I want to travel is a pull factor. And unfortunately, that doesn't give people a lot of motivation. So if you're struggling with your pull factors, what you want your identity to be, what you want your life to be in the future, can you guide us through a process through which we might get more specific around pull factors?
Yeah, I think the specificity is very helpful. One of the things that I recommend, though, is some space. So I try to help support entrepreneurs to not jump into something new or even do a big detailed plan for the first 6 months after they exit. But perhaps in that 6 months, you develop a little bit of a syllabus, a little bit of a learning plan for yourself. Maybe some books you'd like to read, maybe a gardening project you'd like to do, maybe a new skill you'd like to learn with your hands, something that's super different than the business that you've been doing. So having some structure and meaningful infusion or meaningful planning around your time is really important, but not too much. Don't pour the cement yet for the new foundation. Like, wait for the concrete. Let things be a little bit fluid, but still some structure. So go ahead.
Give us the reading list. What are the top 3 books every entrepreneur should read in the first 6 months after leaving their company, between gardening sessions and contemplative walks on the beach? What are the 3 books they need to read?
Actually, I usually request that they read things that have nothing to do with business. Fiction, poetry. Have you read Harry Potter? I mean, sort of the things that weren't happening when they were doing their other work.
One of the things that we hear a lot in terms of regret, and I think it eats away at entrepreneurs at a very sort of challenging level, and I think it undermines their mental health, is they will sell their company in what they believe to be a fair and good price for their company. And there'll be a wonderful moment of euphoria, followed by kind of a leveling out. And then oftentimes a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road, something happens where they start to question, did they leave money on the table?
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those things where you only have some giant economic event, like selling a home, selling a business a couple times in your life, and if you're lucky. And there is this natural inclination to want to look backwards. And once you've had some distance from it, say, ooh, maybe I could have done better. Mm. What advice would you have for an entrepreneur who's sitting on the rocking chair, contemplating the world, and starts to feel like maybe they left money on the table?
Yeah. I'd be curious about the money story that drives that. And I think there's a conversation to be had about, how does it serve you, right? How does this question serve you? What's the question under the question that you're trying to answer? Do I have enough? Do I have enough economic stability? Is there enough in my bank account? Or is it that I want to get back in the game? I want that negotiation. I want to play chess again. I think sometimes there's a little bit of a desire to rethink an exit strategy because it's just the last big negotiation that you did And if you are missing that part of the sort of chess game of entrepreneurship, of running a business, that's an important thing to consider. Like, what is in you that's activated about this money question? Sometimes it's the money, but often it's not. Often it's a deeper desire to use a part of yourself that's dormant on the rocking chair right now.
Agree. I also sometimes wonder if there's a sense of feeling duped. Like I got taken advantage of. I got taken.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody likes that feeling of being kind of ripped off.
Sure.
And it can be, I think, pretty cancerous if you're walking around life feeling like somebody ripped you off. That can be a very negative emotion, no?
Oh, it's absolutely toxic, especially about something that happened in the past over which you can do nothing about. The bottom line is that the negotiation happened based on all of the variables and the factors that were known at the time. And so fast forwarding 2 years, 3 years, maybe the landscape looks very different. Maybe the company looks very different, but you're going backwards and rehashing and sort of ruminating. And that sense of sort of poisonous, I got duped, I got cheated, I should have done better, I could have done better. As much as those kinds of thoughts are very alluring, we get stuck in them because they are about safety. And so our brains are really oriented to keep thinking about them over and over. They almost always do nothing to serve us. And so, a helpful counterbalance is a gratitude practice. It is a sense of like, here's all the things that went right. Here's all the things that I've gained in my life over this exit. And so maybe I left 2 million, 3 million. Maybe it could have been better or different. But generally speaking, most people who are having this conversation with themselves on the rocking chair have done okay enough.
Well said. What's your experience working with entrepreneurs who have come to own their business in different ways? And I'm thinking there are, in my mind, sort of 3 ways that entrepreneurs, become entrepreneurs. They're either founders of a business. They started it in, the classic story of, in their garage or whatever. They may have inherited it. And in the second case, I'm thinking of both inherited in a familiar, like passing it from one generation to the next, as well as a management buyout where a second generation of managers takes over from a first generation. Or they may have purchased it. And in the latter case, we're seeing more of that as the baby boomers retire and the younger generation comes and buys those companies. We're seeing people that are running companies they didn't start. And I'd just be curious from your perspective, what impact how they came about owning their company has on some of the issues we've been talking about today, how you might sell it, how you might think about running it, et cetera.
Yeah. There's an interesting study that used fMRI imaging, so brain scan imagery, and asked entrepreneurs, founders specifically, so people who started the company, to look at an image of their company, like their logo or something like that, and then looked at the brain structures that were highly activated during that activity and compared that activation to the brains of parents looking at their children. And probably no surprise to you and others who are listening, very, very similar neurological activation in founders as they looked at images of their company.
That's crazy.
So there is this. Yes.
You hear about that, but I've never heard it actually measured objectively.
I'll send you the link
crazy.
to the study. The parts of the brain that were activated were the reward center. So essentially the neurological pathways consistent with love and sort of this adoring adoration. And then the other part of the brain that was unusual was a suppression in the sort of critical reflection. So this is where, we all think we have the most beautiful baby. Founders all think they have the most beautiful company. So that's where I think there is some uniqueness in the experience of a founder who has birthed the company, where they may be less able to objectively evaluate their company. They may be just so sort of deeply attached neurologically that it makes the sale process a little bit different than it would be for someone who maybe purchased the company, has already gone through due diligence, has sort of done the objective negotiation of a deal around this company. That feels very different than I made this.
Mm.
So sort of, I think in the case of a founder in particular, the more emotional attachment, the more identity overlap with the company, the more important the team around you is in terms of those advisors, the brokers, the lawyers, the helpers, the people who are able to be your objective backstop. That's, of course, important in all of these deals, but particularly for that founder, they're going to have a little bit of a different neurological reality than other kinds of owners.
What about people who inherit their company? In this case, I would like to drill into family transition. So I've seen a couple things happen here. One, little Jane or Johnny inherits the company and is bound and determined to do better than their parents. They're just so eager for validation and that I deserve this, and I wasn't just the lucky sperm. I actually, deserve to be here. So there's a sense of
they've got something to prove.
They've got something. Thank you for filling the words in for me. Something to prove. And then there's the other piece that I've also seen among second generation and third generation owners is they have this sort of conflict with being the guardian of the business as opposed to its owner. The old fancy watch commercial, I think Philip Patek or one of them is like, you never really own a Philip Patek watch. You just care for it until you get to pass it down to the next generation.
You're just the steward.
Thank you. You're great at filling in my words today. You're just the steward of this business. And I'd be curious to know in both cases, how you would advise an entrepreneur in both of those cases. First, let's start with this idea of like wanting to prove themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think whatever the narrative is, it's really important to get as clear as you can about what that complicated narrative is. And that's very true in all of these inherited businesses. Your relationship with your parent, which is complicated for all of us on a good day, is now overlaid with your vocation and your relationship with your business, which is also almost always a bit complicated. And so for folks who are in that situation of having inherited a business, doing the work ideally before you get to this sale conversation about what the inherited story is. So if you're someone who's like, I got something to prove, I just got to live up to this mantle. Or if you're someone who is, I'm just sort of tending this for mom and dad. Or there are also cases where people are kind of angry at their parent. Maybe they're sort of resentful that they could dump this with this business. Maybe they wanted to go and like join the Peace Corps, but no, here they are selling tires. Like it's just not the dream that they had for themselves. So that also plays in when there's some sort of lingering resentment. So, I mean, not to push or plug my business, but I do think like, doing the deeper work to work with a psychologist, a mental health professional, a coach. I know you have some processes in place that help people get at this so that they can hold the story alongside the business negotiation, right? We want to kind of have our eyeballs on all of the variables that are shaping how we enter a sale. It doesn't mean we can solve them all, but we want to know what they are and where they may derail us or shape our thinking or influence the kind of a deal that we are willing to make.
How would you advise an entrepreneur who's feeling guilty about selling a company they've inherited? So imagine a 50-year-old person listening to this podcast who's inherited a business that's now worth $30 million. They grew up modestly. They grew up in a middle-class house. Their parents sacrificed, and their parents are now well into their 80s and living a modest life. But here they are sitting as the owner, second generation of a business that has a massive market value, $30 million, like enough to live generations from now.
Yeah.
And they feel conflicted. They feel guilty. They're like, I don't deserve this. I inherited this thing. I would not have this if it weren't for my parents. And here I am just standing to gain such a massive amount of money. What would you advise them to do or think through?
Oh, I'd love to explore with them how to really honor the gift that was given. Like the guilt diminishes the gift. The opportunity was offered by these parents who worked so hard. And it's possible that this is exactly what they had in mind, that the business would create generational wealth for their family for years to come. And so to be able to work past the guilt, release the guilt, and say, this is the best story ever. And it's also possible that you are not the best steward of that company. So with a very mindful exit, thinking through how this company can be transferred to hands that maybe have more experience or are better positioned to help grow the company to even, greater heights. It's possible that this exit can be wonderful for the family story as well as for the business story, and both are served. And I got to believe that that was the intention of Ma and Pa back in the day, is both to create wealth and to build something.
Yeah. I think that's probably true. Unfortunately, I've seen examples where mom and dad feel a bit resentful of their child and wish, the child may have grown the business from, 500 grand in sales to 50 million in sales. Like, so the lion's share of the benefit should accrue to the second generation because they're the ones who've made such incredible progress. Yet the parents can sometimes feel resentful that, well, they would never had it ever were for us. But again, that's probably more, to your point, a little less common than it would be that the parents are putting their kids in a spot that they hope will be good for them.
And it is painful when other people don't feel good about our successes, especially people who are close to us, like parents or family members who may have trouble really celebrating a positive outcome. And I think that's a surprisingly common experience with exits, whether it's parents or other people in your life who, whether they're jealous or resentful or they have their own story, they don't think that you should have it, and they will diminish your joy. They'll take as much of the pleasure out of the experience as you will let them. And so that's where it's part of our work as mature adults to not feel responsible for other people's feelings.
And how do you do that? Especially if it's your parents who, man, that's a complicated labyrinth of connections. Like if you did get if you were advising an entrepreneur who was just, other people were resentful of their success, their financial success, their life success, whatever, what would you sort of coach them to think about or do to get over that?
I think there's first an internal questioning. It's like, am I behaving in an ethical way? Do I feel clear about my boundaries? Would it be helpful, or does it feel ethical, reasonable to pass some of this wealth back on to the parents? Or, what's the quote unquote right decision related to or based in my moral code? What seems reasonable? Is there something that I can do meaningfully to change this dynamic? Sometimes there is, often there's not. And then I think another thing that's important is for folks at that level of success to find their tribe. Because I think as you're having a successful exit, the amount of people who have that experience becomes, increasingly small. You're not likely to run into another multi-million exit founder at,
Starbucks,
your kid's friend's birthday party. So finding your tribe of people who've had similar experiences, I think is really helpful in balancing some of these questions, because it can feel so alone and so isolating.
That's such an interesting insight, because I think sometimes founders, who go through a sale, some buy the big house and the big car, others don't. They keep the same tribe they had before to their, and rightly so. These are friends and deep, family and so forth. But if they have this sort of giant secret in the back of their head, which is that they've had this huge liquidity event, it can feel very disorienting, because you have this sort of big difference between you and your immediate circle of friends that you've had for ages. And it can feel very, I think, disorienting.
And I think it's helpful to go back and forth, right? To keep those relationships with the people that you've known since T-ball days, or whoever your tribe is. This is a thing that's happened in your life, but it doesn't need to redefine you, and probably it shouldn't redefine you. But also, it is enough of an sort of exemplary experience that you might need some new tribe. You might need some additional people in your life who have a sense of that experience, who are even sort of working through or thinking about how to wield that kind of wealth. I mean, most of us don't know how to do that. So just the financial implications of having that much money, you need a new kind of crew of people who are thoughtful about it.
Yeah, I'm really glad you bring up your identity or an entrepreneur's identity. And one of the questions on Prescore is, which of the following would you be most likely to agree with? I am a business owner, or I own a business.
Mm-hmm.
And as you might imagine, the reason we're
Great
asking that question is for folks who say, I am a business owner, it's like, I am a basketball player. Well, you're a basketball player right up until the time you retire from professional basketball, and then you're lost because your entire identity is wrapped up in your self-definition of what you are is the same as what you do. I mean, do you think, like, maybe just kind of riff with me on that question?
Yeah. Identity versus activity, right? I do a thing, I am a thing. And the distinction there is really important because we do lots of different things, right? 15 different things I do in a day. I go for a walk, I feed my dog, I feed my kids, like whatever. Those are the activities of my life. And they're important. They're how I spend my time. They're how I spend a lot of my life. But it's not that same core identity. We can only have so many identities. That's a much more limited kind of factor.
What if the surname of the entrepreneur is in their company name?
Ooh.
So it's like, Johnson and Sons Moving, and Johnson retires, sells his company, and yet he sees his trucks driving around the neighborhood every second day. What advice would you give Johnson?
Ooh, I hope that's just a little infusion of like, yeah, I did that. Look at that. Look at the thing that outlives me. Look at the thing that's still going on, even though I don't have to participate anymore. I would hope that there's a little sense of pride and of having built a legacy.
It's like watching your kid. You mentioned earlier, there's a lot of parallels between giving birth and then having a child leave the home to exiting a company. And it's like, when you watch your kid do something, polite to a stranger, opens the door for somebody, does something without you prompting, for me, it just brings, enormous pride. I didn't have to tell him to do that. He just did it. And that's doesn't happen that often, but when it does, it's those moments of sheer, unadulterated pride. So that's an interesting reframing for a lot of folks, for sure. One of the big regrets that we hear entrepreneurs have around exit is how their employees were treated in the process. And you know this from some of your work and a lot of your work with your clinical patients and maybe some work with just friends and others. When you sell a company, every outside advisor will give you a couple of pieces of sort of ironclad advice. One of them is never tell your employees, because the moment you tell your employees, you undermine your negotiating leverage. Yep. They start looking for a job. The market finds out. Chaos ensues. Sometimes the acquirer looks to do an end run and talk to the employee. I mean, it's just like there's a whole litany of things that can go wrong when you tell your employees. Yet, for an entrepreneur going through a sale, it can be like the cheating spouse who's walking around the house with this giant secret. And they find it incredibly difficult to live those two lives in parallel, to have this giant secret, like I'm about to sell my company, and at the same time look squarely in the eyes of their employees and pretend like nothing's changed or nothing's going on.
Make a great plan for Q3.
Yeah, like go get him, Tiger. Like it's a really, really difficult tightrope to walk. What advice would you have for an entrepreneur who feels desperate to tell his or her employees?
Yeah, I'm so glad you draw attention to this, because I think it is one of those things that really is kind of like a gut check for people. And you're right. There's this wisdom that's relevant to the process of a sale that is a departure from how most people have led up until that point. So even the negotiation around a sale is the beginning of the end. It's the transition that you're making from leading the team to now ushering the business through the sale. Your job is different. And so I think it's important to sort of name that, and to name, like, my allegiance is no longer to the team in the same way that it was. It's now to the company having a productive exit, and to begin to grieve the loss of that, and to identify previously our work together was the foundation of trust and of sort of shared collaborative vision. But now my vision is shifting and my team has to carry on while I'm now moving in a different direction. And the trajectory of that will carry through. Like, that's the ultimate departure of the leader from the business if the team stays intact. So this is the beginning of the end. And noticing that, noting it, feeling it, holding that carefully, I think is hard to do, but important to do.
I'm glad you brought up grief, because again, I've heard for a lot of entrepreneurs selling a company, there is a period of grieving. As ironic as that is, you have this incredible financial result, but there's this period of grieving. And you've written extensively on this topic. Touching Two Worlds is about dealing with grief. Maybe, if you don't mind, and I realize
Sure.
this might be a sensitive topic, but would you be willing to share sort of why you wrote Touching Two Worlds and sort of what it's about, and some things that folks can maybe take away from that construct that you write about?
Yeah. So the book was really born from my experience of having significant loss in my life. I lost my dad to cancer and my brother to suicide in a very tight time period, and within 6 months of each other. And so while I'm growing my business and launching my other book and sort of doing all of these things in my professional career, I'm also in the middle of very significant grief and loss. So Touching Two Worlds is sort of like the response to how you live as someone who is experiencing loss and present to it, not running from it, but also live in the world of kind of joy and continuing to build and continuing to raise kids and like make things happen in the world. So I think a lot of entrepreneurs and high performers sort of struggle to enter grief because it feels so opposite to the energy of building. But I think when we don't grieve, when we don't acknowledge the emotional implications that come along with loss, we basically wall off little corners of ourselves inside. And we fail to either learn from those experiences, but to be present to sort of the full range of our humanness. So in the example of somebody who's leaving a company, even though it's a wonderful outcome, hopefully, there's still losses involved. You're not going to go to that office anymore. You're not going to lead that team in that way. You're not going to be identified with that brand in the same way. And giving the emotional space to say, this used to be part of my life and it's not anymore. And I have some feelings about that. Very human, very reasonable, psychologically probably very important to do. And I think that my work with Touching Two Worlds is very much about how can we acknowledge that both can be true? Something great can be happening, and there's also some grief involved.
Because the tendency is to block out the grief and just proceed as though nothing's happening, because there's all these wonderful things and you're expected to lead and so forth.
Yeah, people want it to be one thing, right? Having a great, successful exit, walking away with $30 million, yay, hooray. It should all be sunshine and roses. And of course it's not. There's losses that are involved.
Man, I could talk to you for hours. I think we're kindred spirits. There's tons of stuff we could do, but your time is precious. I'm so grateful for you sharing some of your wisdom with us. Where can people, if they wanted to reach out, I'll link up the books and the pod in the show notes. Is there a way for folks to reach out to you, like LinkedIn or Twitter? Or what's your preferred sort of?
Yeah, I'm pretty easy to find. Probably the most direct route is the contact sheet on either of my websites, on zenfounder.com or sherrywalling.com. Goes straight to my inbox. So it's the best, most direct way to find me.
Zenfounder.com. The books are The Entrepreneur's Guide to Keeping Your Shit Together. I love the title. And Touching Two Worlds. The podcast is called Zen Founder. Dr. Sherry Walling, thanks for doing this.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, John.